Hello, and welcome to the Weekly Scroll Podcast. My name is Ryan, and today we have a very special guest. That is Watt. How are you doing today, Watt?
So good. So good. Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy
Starting
New
off
Year.
fun
This
and
is
fresh.
the first episode, technically the first episode of the year, because the review did happen on like the 30th. So you're kicking us off for 2025. And for those that can actually see the stream right now, or YouTube, thank you for watching. This Hunter is not here, obviously. Today we are going to continue our writing seminar series, which apparently that has become this, with Watt here. Watt, what is today's writing seminar, and what are we going to be talking about?
Yeah, so we can kick over to the presentation. The name of the seminar is Writing Literary Adventures for Cloud Empress and Beyond. So we'll talk a little bit about why we're doing this, but the idea was to expand it a little bit beyond just writing for Cloud Empress, to share a little bit about my workflow and support Winter Game Jam that's coming up. So really excited about that I'll talk more about. So I'll just give a little intro to me before we hop into the more presentation aspect. My name is Watt. I'm a queer indie tabletop role-playing game designer. I'm best known for Cloud Empress. I've been writing since 2011 pretty seriously for publication, but only writing for TTRPG since 2021. We're going to be talking a lot about writing today, so I just thought sharing a little bit more about my writing history would be helpful. I have a number of smaller games and stuff that I've done on game jams and stuff that you can find on my itch.io as well that I'll be mentioning. And you can follow me on Blue Sky in the link below. So I also have a publishing company. It's just me, but Worlds by Watt is the name it goes under. So you may see that on some books, including Cloud Empress. And the real goal of my publishing work and writing work to some extent is trying to make the world like a kinder, stronger place through the TTRPG writing that I do. And so some of the other aspects I'll just call out real quick is that made a pledge to donate 1% of all of the company's profits to climate-related charities and actions through this organization called 1% for the Planet. And we also have a Cloud Empress Creators Fund that funds marginalized and underrepresented authors creating adventure content in a science fantasy setting.
Real quick,
yeah.
The presentation, I believe you're going through it, but it is not advancing for me.
Oh, interesting. Let's try. Are you seeing it now?
I am, and it is advancing.
Okay, it's going now?
Yep.
Cool.
All right,
let me know if we have more issues. Thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely.
So this is a picture of my head from the past. This is my logo that you might not have seen. And this is Cloud Empress. It is a Nausicaa-inspired hex crawl campaign setting. It's science fantasy. It has giant cicadas and magic and all sorts of stuff. But it's compatible with the Mothership RPG D100 system, which is called the Panic Engine for sort of non-Mothership setting content. You'll see more of that. It's sort of a newer title that's come out. Just a little bit about the history of Cloud Empress. We did a campaign in 2022 to 2023. It was a number of zine books that came out. And then there was we're doing a reprint, which is a hardcover box set reprint, including 2 new setting books. That's currently in fulfillment. So we kickstarted it in 2024, and it'll be coming out hopefully late summer, early fall for 2025. Really excited to have a number of awards and praise for the book. So I won a Silver Emmy for best writing. There's the awards. Cloud Empress was selected as a 2024 awards recipient. Recently been named a couple top 10 games of 2024, including the Weekly Scrolls #2 overall game of 2024. So very humbled and excited to have folks recognize the work and be excited about the writing in particular. This is just a picture of what the new stuff is looking like, just so you get a better sense of sort of the art style and graphic design, very 70s inspired. Like I said, Studio Ghibli, Nausicaa, Hayao Miyazaki kind of inspired as well. Why are we doing the presentation? I mentioned a little bit earlier, but there is a winter game jam for Cloud Empress. It runs from Sunday, January 5th to February 2nd, 2025, so about 1 month. It's created by someone named Peter and a team of regular Cloud Empress players and wardens from the RPG Night Utrecht in the Netherlands, probably saying that incorrectly, but they put together this game jam to create winter content. Cloud Empress is set during a particular summer, so they wanted some winter content to play year round. And so really excited that they've held this for us and that this will be happening. Because it's just a month, really encouraging folks to focus on short form content, one-page expansions, pamphlets, mini zines, those kinds of things. So I created some templates as well that you can use. I put a picture here that you can see, but there's a one-pager, a trifold pamphlet, and a booklet template to get you started with some sort of official branded Cloud Empress materials. And you can grab that from the link below, cloudempress.com/third party. Those are for Affinity, which is what I use for layout. But there are some other free templates, I think, listed in the game jam as well. Just a little bit of a note around third-party content. It's a pretty standard, at least in the indie tabletop role-playing game third-party license. You're free to create compatible work with Cloud Empress and monetize it. There's just a couple little stipulations, and you need to include a blank as an independent production of your publisher name and not affiliated by my company. And you can't use copyrighted materials such as Cloud Empress, like original text and artwork. So what are we going to be talking about today? What are literary adventures? We'll talk about that in a bit, but my three primary goals for this presentation today: first, to define this concept of literary tabletop role-playing game adventure, and next, share my method for writing TTRPG adventures with some specific practical advice for writing within the Cloud Empress setting, and hopefully just overall inspire you to take some risks, express your creative, authentic voice in tabletop role-playing game adventure writing. So I have a whole page of caveats. One of them that I mentioned earlier is that I've only been in the scene since 2021. So there are probably many more examples of adventures that I could pull out if I read them. I have not really seen any discourse around this idea of literary tabletop role-playing game adventures. I don't know, Ryan, we can talk about that in the Q&A if you've seen stuff. There is one post that I found that sort of posits the idea or mentions that there could be more literary writing in this field, but doesn't necessarily define what that would look like exactly, or bring a number of examples, more contemporary works. The other piece with that is that this is something I'm sort of cobbling together to sort of explain my writing process and summarize some of the work that I do. So no TTRPG authors, to my knowledge, actually categorize their work in this own way. It's not some kind of movement or something that people are talking about themselves. And I didn't use this kind of thinking necessarily when I was actually writing Cloud Empress, at least the first content. This is just a sort of summary and categorization that helps me understand my work and might help you understand it better as well. The other big piece is, like all taxonomies, in my opinion, and categorizations eventually become meaningless if they become way too broad or way too narrow. And so this is really just one tool to help you understand some of the work that I've been doing and how I think about my own work. So feel free to use it if it's helpful. If not, you can throw it away or ignore it. And in bold and sort of mega important is that there's not one best way to write an adventure. There's not one best way to run a tabletop role-playing game. There's lots of different types of games, lots of different adventures. They're for different audiences with people with different tastes, wants, desires, etc. And so calling something like more literary than something else doesn't mean it's better written or that it's a better game. It's just may have some certain characteristics under this sort of arbitrary taxonomy that we're going to be positing. So why should we care whether a TTRPG adventure is literary or not before we even hop into some of the definitions? Why do I care? Well, coming into the tabletop role-playing game scene, especially the indie scene, struggled to sort of understand why I like certain adventures and certain TTRPG writers more than others. I couldn't really put a finger on what made something more successful to me. And I enjoyed more. I mean, I could say, oh, I like this more than that, but thinking a little bit more deeply about that has helped me sort of define my own work and help me create my own voice. I like to develop some creative principles for projects that I work on and some pillars of design that you'll see in like video game design and those things. So this has helped me create my creative voice. I was also interested in finding parallels between some of my favorite fiction. I've been a long reader and read a lot of fantasy and science fiction in particular. And so I wanted to see what comparables and what elements could be drawn from my favorite science fiction, fantasy, and literary fiction over to TTRPG writing, and ultimately create writing that emotionally moved people, intellectually moved people. The other piece, and I'll say this a couple more times, at least with my writing philosophy, is that I read, and maybe Ryan, I don't know if you're in this camp, I read a lot more TTRPGs and TTRPG adventures than I get to play, maybe by a scale of like 10-1 or more. So I read a lot, and what I was thinking around creating Cloud Empress was creating something that would be very enjoyable as a reading experience and as a game experience, and really thinking about the reader as a valuable audience member, not only the players at the table or the GM or warden who's running it at the table in that particular moment. So let's get into definitions. What is a literary adventure according to Watt? Me. I was a librarian for 10 years. So to start with what a literary adventure is, I thought we'd start with defining literary fiction, a categorization of contemporary fiction and modern fiction. Literary fiction is a loose and inadequate definition. It's used conversationally in certain ways around work that feels more serious, that's more intricate, often more pretentious, or challenging to read. It's often not applied to genre works such as fantasy or science fiction work or horror, although that's more recognized nowadays than in the past. I found this definition or characteristics from this blog called Bookish Bay that's linked here that I think helped me understand the concept and apply this to RPGs and adventures in this presentation, which is these 4 characteristics: rich prose and meticulous use of language, nuanced exploration of characters' inner lives, thought-provoking themes, and an emphasis on the human condition. And if we contrast that with maybe more genre fiction or popular fiction, those tend to be more concerned with plot-driven narratives, external conflicts, and the use of recognizable tropes versus some of these elements. So one is not better than the other. There tend to be these trends, at least when we arbitrarily categorize things into genre. And the other piece too, with the word literary and literature and all that kind of stuff, oftentimes it's just this catch-all for anything that people think is well written. So something they feel is well written, well, that's literary, that's literature. Quite arbitrary at times as well. These are some literary fiction examples I particularly like. There are more standout examples that maybe define the genre in general, but these are ones that I draw inspiration from. Blood Meridian, A Visit from the Goon Squad, The Stranger, The Invisible Man, As I Lay Dying, The Crying Lot 30. And like I said, I draw a lot of inspiration from literary fantasy, literary science fiction. Slaughterhouse-5, Shadow and Claw, Tahano and the whole Earthsea series, Dahlgrim, A Scanner Darkly, Who Fears Death, and the Southern Reach series are all big inspirations in my tabletop role-playing game writing. And I'll include those sometimes in some of my Kickstarter marketing and always get a kick out of when people say, oh, Dahlgrim, that's so exciting. So going back to that definition, this will be the sort of framework I'm applying on my own work and some adventures that I've read and examples that I'll call out. So this rich prose and stylistic use of language, that exploration of characters' inner lives, thought-provoking themes, and the emphasis on the human condition. So these are some examples of works. Again, these authors, I'm guessing, would not categorize this work this way. I've never seen them do that, at least in my experience with their work. and social media presences. But The Isle by Luke Gearing is a really pivotal work in the development of Cloud Empress. If you're not familiar, it's really good. You should check it out. It is notable for first having no artwork. There are maps, but there are no other forms of artwork. The second piece is that it doesn't have hardly any summary text. And so at the time that it was published, I saw people saying, I'm running this as a GM and I'm not reading ahead. So we're all getting surprised, and folks were able to do that. It really feels like an active discovery during the reading process, which I think is particularly unique and was just a really enjoyable read, while also having some larger humanistic themes, I think, embedded in some of the characters and descriptions there. A recent read that I included a quote from that you can take a look at when I send the PowerPoint out later is Crush Depth Apparatus by Amanda Lee Frank is so good. This was one of the most unique examples of NPC writing I've seen. I'm guessing there are other examples like this, but Amanda uses quotes from each character with a brief multi-word description of their occupation on the submarine. I think it's a particularly good example of how a pretty simple concept, it's a haunted submarine. We see a lot of that kind of stuff, particularly in Mothership. It's a haunted ship. There's a monster on the ship. This is a really great example of how to use literary writing and fantastic prose to maybe not elevate it. I'm not going to use that, but to really embellish the humanity and the themes that I think Amanda was exploring, and just such a fantastic read. So I really encourage that. 1,000 Islands by ZXU. I'm not sure how in print that is. I know you might still be able to get a copy of Reach of the Roach God. I didn't list that as my title because I haven't read it because I'm sort of afraid of cockroaches. So that's on my list, but that might be more available. Thousand Empty Light by Alfred Valley. Silent Titans by Patrick Stewart is sort of this gonzo adventure into these giant beings, and it's quite strange and creative and playful and imaginative while also being fantastically written. And I'll call out one Cloud Empress adventure. I love all the adventures we publish, but Labyrinth of the Bride by Kiana Shaw, I think, does a particularly good job of creating this sort of eerie literary style that I really enjoy reading as well. So just a few examples. The other thing, I'll return real quick. I think there are many more examples of literary games or literary inspired games. So a lot of Snow's work, including the Wizards and Wastes, I think is a great example. But we're talking about adventures today. So there are more examples of games that have a literary style or have some really fantastic writing that explores these same kind of themes. But our focus today is writing expansion content and short form adventures. So that's what I wanted to focus on, at least in terms of my recommendations and references. So the last sort of major portion of the presentation today is really how to write for Cloud Empress and how I write literary adventures, if we want to call them that. We'll go through some specific examples, but I wanted to start with some of the goals that I had when I started writing Cloud Empress and still do, writing expansion content for the game. I like to have a question or something that's troubling me. I like to explore that through the writing process and the design process of tabletop role-playing games. So with Cloud Empress, I was interested in exploring my questions and anxiety related to climate change. And really, what does human resilience mean? How do humans and people find the joys within life in a increasingly challenging environment? But also this sense of hope that comes with resilience. And so Cloud Empress takes place in a post-apocalypse. The apocalypse has happened and people are still living in this rural life, finding joys amidst giant cicadas and lots of challenges. As a publisher, a lot of my work is inspired by Hayao Miyazaki's work, and so wanted to draw out these morally complex characters and villains that Hayao Miyazaki is most known for, that I think make his work exceptional and humanist and political and very great. We talked about it a couple times, and I'll probably bring it up a couple times more, but really wanted to make the reading experience as enjoyable as playing it. My idea is, and I think I hear some of this from players, that if we can evoke an emotional reaction from the reader, they'll be better able to transfer that reaction and interest in the world to their players. So even though something might not be as easily digestible or as easy to parse at the table, if we can create a memorable reading experience, it's possible that that can become more impactful at the table than simply having some bullet points about a character that are really maybe simplistic or super high level for that character, such as the Amanda Lee Frank quote, right? It's a quote that's not going to be great table reference, but it might be especially evocative so that you get to know the character and remember them. Surprise the reader is something I'm really interested in doing. I don't use a lot of explanations up front where I sort of explain what's going to happen. I like to let the text unfold and uncover as the reader and the players go through it. On a design perspective, I wanted to show the ripple effects of violence rather than this idea that violence ends problems. If someone's dead, problem over. I wanted to show that violence creates more violence and harm and trauma. With all of these goals, I realized pretty quickly that I was writing for a relatively experienced game master. It's not to say that newer game masters can't run Cloud Empress, but I decided due to time and space constraints, mainly didn't have enough room in the books and didn't think I was maybe the best person to write a bunch of GM advice based on my own experience and skills. So I don't do a lot of hand holding in the texts themselves. It sort of presents itself and lets GMs sort of figure out how to create mechanisms around that, although there are supporting elements within the rule books. And one of the big things we'll talk about in some of the questions that we've already gotten for the Q&A is this idea of how to use tropes and familiar elements and draw inspiration. Because tabletop role-playing games are imaginary spaces in most cases, and you're traveling through them, you don't have full artwork for everything you're meeting and everything you're seeing. I wanted to use science fantasy tropes, Nausicaa, Dune, Star Wars, A New Hope, to create this shared understanding of the world that people could quickly latch on based on shared cultural experiences while subverting their expectations deliberately and consistently so that it didn't feel highly derivative or, again, going with that element of surprise. Ultimately, I want to write adventures that I want to read and play. I think writing stuff that interests you and excites you is probably the only way to capture an audience interest as well. Shout out to the Liminal Horror writing series, by the way. Those presentations are fantastic. I really encourage folks to look at those. This was sort of covered in one of the, I think, session 2 maybe, but I have 2 forms of adventures primarily, and there's some gray in the middle, but I have these introductory one-shots in Cloud Empress, Last Voyage of the Bean Barge and Funeral of the Anti-Saint, which have these sort of clear hooks that draw players into the location, and they typically trap players there or create really compelling reasons why they can't leave, or if they leave, they're going to be in serious harm. Typically, those types of adventures have 3 to 4 major NPCs that get the little headshots and the belongings and things that we'll look at in a minute. And I like to introduce setting elements as if players are new in those locations and experiment with forms and additional mechanisms and create sometimes novel gameplay experiences. Or in the case of Funeral of the for the Anti-Saint, that was my like murder mystery kind of take, whereas Last Voyage of the Bean Barge is sort of this ship adventure, crashing ship kind of thing that I've seen at times in other tabletop role-playing games as well. These ones I find require playtesting to make them work. The first versions of these did not go very well, and so iteration and playtesting really made them sing a lot better and work a lot more cleanly. The other type of adventures that we'll be spending today's presentation on are what I call locations in conflict, where they are interesting and compelling situations happening at a particular location in a particular moment of time, but I don't use formal adventure hooks or super apparent or explicit reasons for the players to be involved in these locations, especially in the text itself. I really generally don't care if the PCs leave. Cloud Empress is a sandbox hex crawl, and so one of the really great benefits is that if folks aren't interested in something, they can just do something else. So if they come upon the situation and they say, our characters wouldn't be invested in this, they can go somewhere else, and the warden or the GM still has resources to keep the session going. Whereas obviously in other systems or other frameworks or these one-shots, if you say to your warden, we don't want to do this, our characters wouldn't do this, their prep would be thrown out and they might not have something to run for you. So you kind of have to make up reasons or keep your characters in that space for the sake of your wardens and GM's sanity and prep. In these cases, I typically do 1 to 2 major NPCs. These can be difficult to play test, and I find generally not like especially critical to play test if the mechanisms of the game are functioning properly. So we're going to be, again, focusing on these adventure locations. And so this is one from Land of Cicadas. It's called Penance Farm. You can see the spread here, and we'll sort of pop into different elements as we explain my writing process for it. So I don't exactly always follow this, but I generally, with location and conflict, create a concept, define the space, and then fill in the details. And we'll go through each one of these ways to approach the adventure location. So ideating a concept, I especially like this part. It's very fun. What I like to do is take 1 or 2 tropes of science fantasy or science fiction or horror, and I like to mix them together in ideally new ways or add a third element that complexifies them. We'll talk more in the Q&A section. I think there's some interest around inspiration use, but ideally what I like to do based on experience is give inspirations time to settle. So sometimes I'll read something or see something or play something that I get really excited about and I want to bring to the tabletop role-playing game space or adventures. And oftentimes when I start writing in that vein, when I'm really excited about something directly after seeing it, in my experience, the work can feel extremely derivative. It's like a 1-for-1 of what I just watched, or doesn't necessarily have my unique take on things, or doesn't sound like my writing. So I like to let some of my inspirations kind of digest over months or years. And after I've been thinking about something for quite a while, a lot of the details of that text have become fuzzy, and I sort of fill those in with some of the themes or ideas I'm trying to explore. With adventures and the setting in general, I like to find questions or concepts I've been grappling with. But what that means too is I think it's successful. You can tackle social issues or economic or environmental issues or political issues, I think best and most effectively by bringing questions to the setting rather than definitive answers. I find that work that you're trying to espouse a certain ideology or a particular answer tends to feel preachy, or it feels like the writer or the word's trying to tell a particular story, and that can feel restrictive and unfun for the players. So bringing some pieces together that can engage players in conversations about social issues or political issues or environmental issues can be really interesting. But exploring the question and the nuances around those issues, I think, has been most successful for me, at least, and seems to resonate with Cloud Empress's readers, which I'm excited about. So looking at this Penance Farm example, the tropes that I sort of brought to this adventure are floating spores from Nausicaa. Nausicaa has this whole spore jungle with all these floating things that are highly infectious and dangerous. The Last of Us has zombies. There's some zombies in this adventure. And just throwing a third element in, the crucifixion of Christ, this Christian imagery that I'll sort of talk about with one particular character. The questions I was thinking about, consciously or subconsciously, sometimes these happen more than writing out specifically ahead, but was just, how is the fear of the unknown manifest in societies? How do people view miracles when they occur during the moment rather than in hindsight? So we can apply a different narrative to things like after the fact, but what is the experience of the unknown in the moment? So with this general concept, I started writing out the adventure. I centered a lot of the writing around NPCs. I think it's where I get to do some of the most interesting writing in Cloud Empress because I'm not having to define the actual physical space that players need to navigate. And so I think it's best to be cautious at times with navigating space, which we'll talk about. But I like to create morally complex NPCs that make simple solutions to the conflicts that are going on impossible or really challenging to implement, so that more complex negotiations, challenges, problem solving needs to happen. Even though I'm trying to write more nuanced NPCs, sticking to 2 or 3 main ideas can be helpful just to fit within the text box that I have. I like to make everyone a bit tragic. I try to put some hope and resilience in there too, but everyone's a little sad. With that, I try to make a whole person captured in a specific moment in time. One of the things that is somewhat unique about Cloud Empress, at least explicitly, is that it takes place during the summer of the Century Brood. And so it's got this very particular time that it's happening in over a 3 to 4 month period. And so writing NPCs, you're writing them during this time period. The 2 new setting books advance the timeline a couple of months, so they start to take place in the late summer, early fall. So when the setting book takes place is sort of when we're experiencing that character. Like I said, I like to try to evoke some kind of emotional response, really exploring internal conflicts, doubt, shades of gray, uncertainty within a character. I like to, I think it's essential that I expect the reader to take time and effort to read the text before running the adventure. So one of the assumptions and just things I've had to come to terms with is that more prep will be necessary probably to run Cloud Empress than maybe other games. They're not as table reference ready. So some games you can throw on the table, they've got bullet points, they've got bolded text that really help you run it in the moment. Whereas with Cloud Empress, you will need to sort of digest and think about the character. Maybe you'll need to do some work ahead of time and maybe make additional notes with some of those bullets. And this consequently also means that one GM's understanding of an NPC may vary from another, and not being so concerned with representing the character exactly the same across games or players and groups having the same kind of consistent experience, really letting interpretations vary and how certain characters are played or acted within a certain conflict be relatively different depending on who's running them and what the PCs are doing and the environment suggests for those individual groups. So when we look at the Penance Farm NPCs, the major NPC for the space is Spikehead. He is a corpse that came to life miraculously. He looks quite alarming. One of the things I'll mention too is I generally don't write what can be shown in artwork. I'm trying to get better at alt text in the new release so that it is more accessible for folks of a variety of abilities, but I generally don't write a lot of physical descriptions if I have artwork to express those. Spikehead's trapped in an outhouse. Spikehead's childlike and innocent, but we know that Spikehead, based on the information and the rules, is largely infectious and dangerous when injured in particular. And so the characters in the space are dealing with this, what can be considered a monster, right? And the Spore Keepers are the alternative group or faction. They're a group that raise spores in cellars. They're used to fungal infection, so they've got flamethrowers. They're going to burn Spikehead to death in the near future. They're generous. They do check the players to make sure that they aren't carrying infection, but then they offer food and really invite the players in. They're deadly. They have weapons and they have experience taking out these creatures. And they're on a mission to end the infection and help the region. There's this white spore infection that's cropped up that's really unusual. And so they're on this mission. A lot of the spore keepers just sort of stop it and curtail the damages that are happening. but they also want to start a life in the destroyed village. They've come from another village. The village is now unoccupied because of all the death that's happened here with the infection. But so they are imagining this future for themselves in this space, in future summers and in longer term. So with the location writing, I tend to keep layouts and maps fairly simple. I do look for and want to avoid movement paths, especially indoors where there's no choices, where it's sort of the singular railroad or snake that people have to go on. So I try to give some branching paths that can create things interesting. And there's a lot of writing on dungeon design in particular that you can access with a quick search engine search. Looking for opportunities to sneak in poetic flourishes and sort of exercise prose that makes it a little bit more interesting to read. Sometimes these location descriptions can feel a little utilitarian. I like to include a few boring spaces to accentuate more interesting room ones. So sometimes a room may not have a lot going on, but I think that can create a more surprising element in a future room or a more realistic sort of interpretation of space and time. One of these things, this is like a weird, maybe not weird, but a sort of obsession for me, is that spaces should be useful to the people that sort of exist within the world, right? And so most of the time we're talking about humans. So humans need places to eat, sleep, and void their bodily waste. So I always try to write kitchens, bathrooms, and bedrooms in the locations, particularly bathrooms. So I've seen when we were doing some of the adventures, the mini zine adventures, some of them didn't include bathrooms. And I'm like, we need to put a bathroom in somewhere. Like, let's put the bathroom in. And they don't, those can be those boring spaces, or you can put one or two elements in there. But I always try to put a bathroom somewhere just to make it feel more real. I don't know. I get really caught up when spaces become a little too unreal without those basic things. As I mentioned earlier, this is a location in a specific moment in time. One of the things that I do is freeze the NPCs in specific locations as needed. So in this case, the Spore Keepers are always setting up this pyre when the players get there. They're always making dinner in a certain area. Time does not advance until the players get there, which is maybe a little video gamey, but in many cases, once the players sort of engage with the world, timers can start. But I think writing-wise, it's most interesting to put things in a moment in conflict, and then once the players get there, the clock sort of starts and consequences can start happening. If players really go somewhere totally different or it's months later, then I think some adaptation may be necessary. But again, the narrow time frame of the Land of Cicadas sort of helps in that regard as well. So this is what Penance Farm looks like. It's a small village in the midst of this flame cleaning of this infection. PCs have likely experienced the white spore, at least rumors of it, so they have some prep for this adventure to come. The Spore Keepers immediately sort of call out to the PCs and hold them at gunpoint to investigate whether the PCs are infected or not. Once they're cleared, they're invited into dinner really generously, and they can have a meal and warm and pleasant conversation. But we also have Spikehead in the outhouse, who is calling for assistance and speaking through this barred window. A really sympathetic character, probably to the players, who's sort of asking for help, but quite alarming looking and, again, potentially dangerous. This is the next part, which is the writing your ass off. This is just you write as hard as you can, write as best as you can. I think some notes on that are sometimes I'll feel myself in autopilot and I'll say, okay, I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. I just need to write it now. And a lot of times I find that when I'm doing that, I'm leaning too heavily on trope. So I'm saying, oh, I know what's going to happen. And a lot of times I'll be pulling from like a movie or a TV show or what I expect a D&D adventure to look like. And so when I start feeling things are especially simple or obvious, that's when I stop and sort of subvert expectations or think about a more interesting approach. Sometimes this happens during a revision as well. I like to, this is something I got from a blog post that I can't remember where or who, but this idea of putting one original or unusual idea at least on each page. So what's something like really unique to the setting or the space that is not present, or maybe the players haven't seen before, or the reader hasn't seen before. There's not a whole lot that's original, but again, you can combine things in new ways or put new contexts around tropes and elements that might feel unusual. I like to focus on the sound and appearance of language. Sometimes I'll read the prose out aloud to hear how it sounds. In line with that, I generally avoid adding game mechanisms in my writing. So I don't say, make a speed check, make a body save. I do not like reading those in adventures. I find them really boring. I find them break up the text. I see Ryan's head nodding. And this goes in line with who is your audience. So if I'm writing for a more novice or inexperienced game master, maybe I would include those. But the assumption here is that wardens will use this text in a variety of ways. They'll need to make their own decisions. It's not a reference text at the table primarily, although you certainly probably want to have it on hand. So the idea with that is just that they can do that on their own. They can listen to the situation, listen to the players, and make those calls on their own. I like adding poetic phrases wherever I can, but not in a way that they intrude or become obnoxious. If something doesn't feel right or feels boring, or some paragraphs, I'm like, that's a key for me to rewrite it if I have time and see if I can come up with something a bit better. With that and this literary, again, framework, looking for opportunities to comment on the greater human experience or the overall nature of the world and setting. And that's sort of looking outside of the adventure, where we might ascertain certain elements about human experience, or just something a little bit more poetic that speaks to things outside of the individual adventure and the conflict that's happening. So how does this adventure speak to human nature? How does this adventure speak to the nature of conflict within our present day world? I think that stuff can be really interesting when done thoughtfully. And writing is hard. It's hard to do. And so good luck. It's not impossible. Writing bad is actually quite easy. Writing well is more challenging. So we'll talk more about just getting the words on page and finishing stuff is so valuable, and not worrying too much about making something that's great. Just finishing something. There are some examples here. I'll read the Spikehead one. I don't want to do too much reading, but these are just some little flourishes that I think I fit into the Penance Farm adventure that I'm still happy with. What miracle isn't disturbing? For aren't miracles meant to be a disturbance to everyday life? The world always takes the side of change, and only one careless cigarette butt is needed to create a wildfire. So that's an example about Spikehead within the individual setting and the individual conflict with the adventure, but it's also commenting on the nature of miracles and how the world changes, the environment changes. So the last piece is filling in the details. These are the things I generally find maybe least interesting, or feel like the most work potentially, but that's like stats, the belongings of different characters and items. For Cloud Empress, just as a benchmark, the average human has about 30 instinct and 3 wounds. You can borrow these stats, though, from other Cloud Empress characters or Mothership NPCs as they make sense. When I'm writing a character's belongings, these are like literally all the things that character is carrying. In case the players steal from them, or they die, or whatever, they offer something up or need to trade. I always try to add 1 or 2 belongings that feel like they complexify the character. So what's 1 or 2 things that are unexpected, or you wouldn't expect, that maybe reveals an insight? Ideally, everything sort of makes sense within the character, but 1 or 2 elements that feel like a subversion. I embed weapons in the belonging list. So in many games, you'll see combat values sort of show up front and center with each NPC and animal and creature and stuff. And so my thought is to really embed those a bit, so that it doesn't become the first thought of the use of the NPC or the character or the soldier or whatever, they're a person who can be dangerous in combat probably, but that's not the first way that we're going to look at them. How I write items and relics, like magic items in Cloud Empress, I typically will sit down and write a list of those first, and then I'll sprinkle those throughout different adventures. That's the way that I find most interesting, unless the adventure sort of hinges around a particular relic or item or situation. And then I might write it in a different order. But I find I have the most fun, and the my brain works the best when I'm just writing a set of those items, and then dispensing them across the setting book. Some of those examples, though, in Cloud Empress are like crests, which are the noble artifacts that they use to use their own form of magic, spells, sticks of chalk, which is the currency, primarily the only sort of tradable currency, weapons, unique weapons, and relics and slippery stuff, which are just magical items in the setting. Those are all good rewards and sort of encourage players to investigate and feel like keep the world a mysterious and magical place, which is some of the vibe that Cloud Empress is going for. So here are some examples of Penance Farm items. We have Spikehead's belongings. Spikehead has beaded jewelry, a gourd canteen, moldy book of prayers, packets of sugar, and Sporekeeper's funeral robes. I would say that packets of sugar maybe and the moldy book of prayers are maybe unexpected on a potentially like monstrous looking creature. There are no relics or particularly interesting items in Penance Farm, which maybe I should rectify, but Abert does send the PCs to this infected household where there is a relic there. So players that sort of do this side quest to clear up an additional home that's on the periphery of the village, there's this thing called the Hound's Incense Burner, where when it's lit, it summons these interdimensional hounds that sort of terrorize the space. So kind of an interesting item that folks can find in the house located on B9 in this case and the hex map. The other piece, this isn't present in Penance Farm. It maybe should have been, but I had, for whatever reason, I think with the layout, I was constricted to a single spread, which is also the reason why I'm showing it today. But you can include and maybe need to include this timeline if the PCs do nothing is sort of the way it's framed in Cloud Empress. So if the PCs ignore the conflict, what advances within the world? And what kind of relevant actions are the NPCs taking to escalate the conflict, and under what timeline? So this is one of this is called the sleeping giant that this comes from, but it's on an hourly setting, and then it jumps to 3 days, and then 4 days later, there's this giant nuclear explosion, and a bunch of cicadas come, eat this giant monster that's dying. The timeline, again, establishes the stakes and key reasons the PCs might seek to intervene and creates consequences within the world so that players I think one of the incentives that's often not fully recognized as designers, we often talk a lot about like what items can someone get or what, but I think like guilt and care and community are all incentives as well. And so if players feel like the world is alive and that, if they care about Spikehead or they care about these Sporekeepers, that becomes a really large incentive and hook, I think, for why someone would get involved beyond, especially in video games where it's like, I'll give you this chest or I have a magic item for you. That doesn't, to me, happen a lot in my day-to-day experience. It's more of this like trust and appreciation or kindness, or even with strangers, there's a thank you where I seem to care about this person rather than a like monetized experience where someone's handing me a $5 bill after I've helped them like with their groceries or something in the neighborhood. So let's talk about some reflections and final thoughts. Hopefully that explains my process. Again, I'll just pop this slide up again, flipping through quite a few, but just to recap the process that I go through, come up with your concept and themes, fill out how that's going to manifest in the space through your NPCs, locations, and writing itself, and then filling in the details with those elements that sort of RPGify what you're doing and make it a game that people want to play and enjoy. Now let's hop over to reflections. These are just some final thoughts I've had. first, these are just some questions you can consider as you're writing or after you've written something to, think about. How much adventure information was obscured, and sort of when would players receive the information? How quickly do they figure out exactly what's going on? Is your text enjoyable for you to read? Do you like reading it? Does the text evoke any particular emotions at any point, particularly with the NPCs? How does the text explore your questions about real world events, politics, the environment, your lived reality, the human experience? So those are some things that I think embody what it means to be literary a little bit, or something that might lean you in that direction, at least feeling a little bit more Cloud Empress related. This is my final unasked for general advice. I think at this point, with how much content is coming out, right? TTRPGs, video games, literature, movies, with so much that's coming out, I am starting to really appreciate risk-taking and weirdness and experiments more than well-crafted conventionality. I grew up as a comic book fan, a big Marvel reader, and I am very, very tired of Marvel movies because they all seem to resolve the same way, with the same stakes, with the same impact on the characters. And so even the Francis Ford Coppola movie, I'm forgetting the name, but I just, that was weird, right? So I like stuff like that. I appreciate things more for their risks, whether they're successful or not. That doesn't always mean they're great or masterpieces of art, but be weird, try some things. The other piece is people can only read what you publish. So be shipping stuff. If you're interested in this at all, like, start on a reasonable project. I think that's one of the great things about the Winter Jam is we've set this constraint. We've given you some tools to make something small. That's how I started doing tabletop role-playing games. From my own background, I always wanted to write this like science fiction series or this big novel and stuff, and I would always get 10 pages in and nothing would work, and I'd feel overwhelmed and I'd stop, right? So I think writing, particularly under a timeline, that's how I have to do all my work now, is I have this many months to get something done, or this many weeks or days, and you just need to finish stuff, at least to publish it and have people enjoy it. So this knowledge that with the Penance Farm example, there are things I want to change, right? But I needed to get it done in a certain way, in a certain time, in a certain layout. And so it's okay if things aren't perfect. If you really care later, you can come back and revise it and republish it, and people will, have that version if you so choose. Try to read as much as you write and write as much as you read. Those are challenging things to do, but if you want to write in this field, I think you should enjoy what you're reading. And if you're not enjoying what you're reading, try to find new stuff or draw inspirations elsewhere. I like to write with an end product in mind and set some goals around that end product. So think about the form factor that you're writing this. Start with maybe the deliverable in your head, and things can change, but I think it's helpful to know, am I writing this for a pamphlet? Is this going to be just a PDF? Am I going to print this as a 8-page zine? Is it going to be a hardcover? Am I making this a whole box set, etc.? Also, what format you're going to be releasing it in. Is this a Kickstarter product versus something I'm releasing on itch? That varies a lot in terms of what expectations and goals and things you might need to do to make that successful. And finally, your thoughts, ideas, and work are important. Art is so nebulous. One of the things that I've been reflecting on, especially with my Spotify Wrapped, in my own case, is some of these artists, I'm like the top 0.001% or 0.1% of this artist's listeners, and they're my favorite musician. I like this artist called Nilüfer Yanya, I believe, and I just like her music a lot, and she's one of my favorite musicians. And apparently, I'm I think she's got a lot of listeners, but I'm like the top percentage point of that, the very top of the cap. So the weird thing you're making might be someone's favorite thing ever, or at least favorite thing in the genre, or favorite thing all year. And so, just because you might not be able to have a wide reach at this point, it doesn't mean that the work you're not doing is valuable. And also, art is really important in ways that I don't understand. It changes people, it changes societies, it reflects societies in these like unknowable ways. And I think it's challenging when you're writing or creating something. It can feel like there's many other things I could do that would have a more immediate and linear outcome in my life. Consuming media, playing video games, all sorts of stuff. But art has this profound impact on both the artist and the society that it's published or given to. And so I think trusting that the work you're doing is important and will mean something to someone creates a stronger imperative to finish it and to get it done. So yeah, I think that is it. I'll give you some next steps, closing things. Again, really encourage you to submit to this game jam January 5th to February 2nd. We've again given you some templates. There's a number of people involved. We have a Discord called Cloud Empress Discord that you can, there's a link on my website, cloudempress.com, but there's a bunch of people already talking about what they're going to come up with, brainstorming, coming up with solutions to challenges or shared questions they're having. I'm monitoring that if you have questions for me. And I will be putting this presentation out, the slides, and maybe the recording answers to the questions potentially that we don't get to on the Cloud Empress newsletter, which is at worldsbywatt.substack.com. So if you want this material, that's where you'll be able to find it in the near future, probably in the next week or two in January. And it's January 2025 for folks watching this in the far future. So I think that's it, Ryan. There's my blue sky again, but we have a number of questions that we can dive into if you're ready for it, Ryan. And you are muted, I believe, or I'm not hearing you.
I was. I should be okay now. All right. So got a whole lot of questions here. How long do you want to go for this? And I'll start from the top and we'll go from there.
Yeah, what time is it? Well, maybe we'll do like 10, 15 minutes, something like that.
Okay. Sounds good. So I think one of the most pertinent questions was what's the first piece of advice you'd give to a first-time adventure writer or game jam entrant, specifically about Cloud Empress and the Winter Jam?
I think being a really type A person, I get ahead of myself. And so one thing I would recommend just for your first game jam and just writing and doing something creative in general is really check in along the way and see if you're enjoying what you're doing. Finishing stuff is awesome, and I really encourage it, but I've done a lot of things in my life because other people told me I was good at them, or I felt good at them, but ultimately they weren't fulfilling, or they were really challenging in ways, or felt creatively draining. So monitor yourself and see where you're at. But I think the thing I would recommend is however long you think it's going to take twice as long, studies show. So pick something small and just get something done. That I would say start with just a one pager, find some Creative Commons artwork, maybe as a starting point even, and then write to the Creative Commons artwork. And I think, if you get done with that and you have more energy in you, you can do another, right? You can keep adding, but finishing stuff is so enriching. It is the lifeblood of my life now in terms of just getting stuff out there. And it also, I find, really alleviates fears of like, what are people going to say about my work? Or what if it's not perfect enough? If you really sunk into this like idea of like, I get stuff done and I get stuff done on a timeline, as things change, but that stuff can alleviate some of those fears as well.
Yeah. You can't fix something that never gets put out. So, I say that as someone who's been working on something for way too long and it won't see the light of day. I have a couple things, and because
Yeah,
this is my stream, I can say it. I just
go
think
for
that
it.
this is not a question, but bathrooms as discourse is definitely a thing, and it's a very interesting discourse when you read up on where do goblins shit in the dungeon. But we don't need to get into that. But I just thought it was interesting when you brought up it has to have a bathroom. But one of the things I wanted to say specifically was you brought up Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, and I often see people use those as inspirations, but specifically for like pastoral and whimsical things, which is part of Ghibli, right? But just about all of Ghibli has a much deeper layer to that. So when you talk about using Miyazaki as an inspiration in literary adventures or in even Cloud Empress, what of the more complex parts of it inspire you, or what have you drawn from that work? Because you can obviously see it in Cloud Empress.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Hayao Miyazaki in particular is my number one inspiration in tabletop role playing game. I go back and back to the works and have been doing reading on, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. To your point, I think there's a real like commercialization and monetization that's happened intentionally by Studio Ghibli, right? But there's Totoros everywhere. There's No Face everywhere. There's these kind of kitschy little plushies and things, but it really at times flattens the complexity of the pieces. And so I think about My Neighbor Totoro, which I saw very, very young, and this like ambiguity and concern about the mother's likely spinal tuberculosis. And so it's a at the same time it's about the pastoral and about the magical. It's in conversation with chronic illness and hospitalization and uncertainty and death and all these kinds of things. And the central conflict of the film becomes about that, with this May being missing. So I think that's something that I like to look at gaps in the market in terms of like a product person, and thinking about what could I do differently. And that was one of the big pieces. I'd seen a lot of Studio Ghibli inspired, but I'd never seen something Nausicaa inspired and on the market. Or I never saw. I have an idea for something that Princess Mononoke inspired. Nausicaa and Princess Mononoke 2, I should say, are my probably my favorite Studio Ghibli films. Um, Totoro has a special place in my heart, but some of the more adult work. And the other piece I think about is that Studio Ghibli's films, and Hayao Miyazaki in particular, are some of the most successful political works I think I've experienced. They have a political leaning and a political message in a way that has developed me as a person. And again, doesn't feel preachy, doesn't feel, I don't know, uncomfortable. It's sort of these messages come out of the themes of the films in a really organic way. And so that's something I've tried to do. Is I really think a lot about politics, climate, economics. I think a lot about the world's problems, about philosophy, and so I want to put that in my work, but in a way that isn't obnoxious. And so I think that's been a great example of Hayao Miyazaki in particular threading these things into his work in a way that feels a part of it, rather than something layered on top or a particular message.
Yeah, great answer. Like I said, I mean, the flattening of the whole thing, like you said, is a part that always bothers me. Because I love Ghibli. Mononoke is my top one or two as well. So if you're doing something for that, I will be very into it. So going back to literary adventures, somebody asked, what is a literary adventure? I feel like we went over that, but is there a way to turn a non-literary adventure literary?
So again, it's my arbitrary distinction, but I think what I would say, we had that checklist of like those elements. I think one of the things that's um, often missing from even stuff that's I consider very well written dungeon writing, or really interesting TTRPG writing, is um, nothing that I can use in my own life to enrich me as a person. It might be like, wow, there's this really interesting thing happening, or these two factions are fighting, but nowhere in the text do I see any kind of um, slight commentary or poke at the broader universal experience or the internal nature of the characters. And so I think adding one or two sentences about even a character, it can come from a character as we saw in the Amanda Lee Frank, but yeah, people are always killing each other. Even just a little sentence, a couple little sentences in there where characters are commenting about the nature of the universe. Um, I don't think that's pretentious, and I think it adds a lot. And I think digging into the depths of your characters a bit more, even in a couple sentences, I think those start to poke towards that way. I think there are many great writers. I think the harder examples are to find are where people are looking a bit outside of the conflict or the genre for things that might be a little bit more philosophical or political or those kinds of elements that may be missing or not included.
Yeah, it really feels, at least part of what I got from the presentation is that um, the way that you are defining literary adventures is really in a depth or like a ability to kind of like zoom out the lens a little bit and to see more than just what's currently happening, but how it sets itself into the wider narrative. I know you talk about human experience a lot, but I think it's what you just said about placing it into the context of the world. Like, oh yeah, this really sucks. It happens all the time. Gives people like a wider depth of complexity, which is something. Again, you're not really going to get that with the old like let's make a 5-room dungeon thing. But when you have a sandbox world like Cloud Empress is, it's really nice to be able to see how that can fit into the wider spread of the entire setting.
I think too, treating your characters as more than material. I think there's this idea of um, treating people as obstacles or using them as like clay, right? This actual material to create violence in many cases. And so I think too, getting out of this mindset of what violence is for, and again, this is I'm not getting like preachy in the text itself, but if you disincentivize violence, you have a lot more space for like spending time with certain characters, or if you and it's sort of the self-feedback, cyclical cycle where if you make more um if it becomes WWE, right, everyone's going to smack everyone with a chair. And sometimes that's fun, and sometimes people like that. But if you are trying to do something more akin to Cloud Empress or some of the goals that I have, if you take away the like big bravado and the spitting water out of your mouth and the fireworks, like it makes it a lot harder to kill people, I think, or at least commit like atrocious acts of violence within the game world. And those things can happen in different spaces and for different reasons, and I'm not necessarily entirely judgmental of that, but I think that would be my other thought on that.
So there is a question that broaches that a little bit. How do you keep the tension and conflict in a relatively low violence setting like Cloud Empress, or at least not that the setting is low violence, because obviously violence
Yeah.
happens a lot, but the characters' actions and stuff. Because for anyone that's read Cloud Empress, there is violence is it's a very specific decision to do that. It's not just I swing my sword now. There are parts of the mechanisms that affect that. So how would you do that?
In Cloud Empress in particular, I've made violence, and I guess it's in Mothership and some of the elements I pulled from Frontier Scum by Carl Druid. Um, that violence is really deadly. And so I think the other piece is that if it happens, it's really bad mechanically. You get stress, you can die from a single wound. There's all these things that make it really dangerous. So I think the threat of violence is something to play with. If this happens, there will be grievous consequences, and we don't want those consequences to occur. And so people become more creative when it's this horrible negative. Um, I think the other piece too is when you have more enriched characters with more complex wants, it becomes less of a you must pay the rent. I won't pay the rent. You must pay the rent. This back and forth of these simple interests that can be more hard to play as a warden. But I think that's where our favorite media, we get to know characters pretty quickly. And it's like, oh, I could fill in a sentence for that character probably. You can always take a break too and, think about it but I think the threat of emphasizing the threat of violence rather than the action itself the consequences of violence. I think Cloud Empress is in many ways obsessed with violence in certain ways, or really centers around it. So I think the other piece is in the weeds, we come upon the aftermath of a battle. And so it's like people crawling around, like people in misery, people, whether these soldiers want to continue the fight or not. So those types of things can be really interesting as well without having actual conflict or combat. I guess conflict, yes, combat, no, kind of thing.
A question from Cerulean5 in chat that they asked, specifically talking about the phases of writing the adventure you were talking about. They said, how linear or iterative is your workflow in practice? Are you working through one phase at a time, or do you go back to concept and defining spaces and work your way back and forth through the phases, or do you generally try to go through it in a linear fashion?
I would say stats and belong. I don't like writing stats. I don't like writing belongings. I don't. Items I'm okay writing that can be interesting sometimes, but that always comes last because I think I enjoy that the least for whatever reason. Um, it feels less essential, even though it's probably one of the most helpful things, at least having certain items and certain things in the game. So that always happens last. I think the ideation usually occurs a lot with the game itself. So the whole game, there's this usually 6 to 9 month ideation process when I'm working on something else and wishing I was working on the new thing. Uh, so I think that's the other thing about finishing stuff. If you finish stuff, you can't work on your new thing that you want to work on. And so you build up all this energy for that new thing. And then when you get there, you're like, oh my gosh. So I think sometimes though, I there's this discovery outliner writing dichotomy that people talk about, or sculptor gardener, where one person really outlines and figures out what's going to happen, and then they write through the outline. The other person being the like discovery writer, which is what I sort of call myself or think about myself, where the act of writing, I don't know what's going to happen, and I write and then I discover what's happening. I find that much more enjoyable than outlining, even though I'll do some layouts and know some of the product space that I need to work in. So at certain times, I'll be writing and I'll say, oh, like I didn't know Spikehead drinks tea, or I didn't know this and that. Sometimes that'll impact the larger themes. Sometimes it'll impact the specifics of the conflict. So that then I'll go back and I'll look through to see if I can accentuate that theme in any way. And I'll do sort of a pass too, like a cleanup pass. Editing is really important. We didn't talk about editing. There's a lot of steps. Mechanically, this was really about writing. But I'll go through and I'll say, like, is there, what are the themes that are coming out? And is there ways that I can elevate that or make those more concise by adding elements later? And so that's sort of a back pass that can sort of accentuate the ideation point or the concepts.
Gotcha. So a question just popped up in chat that is also on the list from someone from your Discord. So I guess I gotta ask it. Are there any naming conventions in Cloud Empress? They said specifically for people and places in the primary setting, something that they might be looking for when they're writing new stuff for Cloud Empress in the Jam.
Yeah, I'm glad we hit this one. There are a list of names in the rulebook that include different regions where people come from. The largest dichotomy is whether someone comes from the lowland wastes or they're on the ground, or whether they're in a cloud city. People have generally one-word names or with a nickname, and they're typically based on things within the real world. So someone might be Root, someone might be Silver, someone might be Snow, someone might be Wind. Those kinds of things are simple names you can use, but the setting is also sort of in the hub of a psychic maelstrom or ripped reality. So we'll have things from the 1800s peeking through, or an old car somewhere, or things that are otherworldly. And so that gives a lot of space to have someone named Henry or someone named Jonathan, or I don't know what kind of names I'm coming up with. So the other thing that I do generally is I like to say names out loud if the players are going to be saying them a lot. Certain names look really good on paper, but when you so yeah, here's it has farmerling names, cloudling names, common names, and ancient names. And so the ancient names are more of the well, some of them are weird. Yeah, so they're sort of a mix. This can be helpful in some of the nicknames. Um, but the other thing, I try to say names out loud, so sometimes things might be really hard to say just with the number, like with the placement of consonants and things. Also, I generally like to use names that are a bit funny at times. So there is a murderous elevator called Little Oregano and a larger god machine called Big Oregano. Um, there's a place called the Thickwood. Um, the Weeds. I try to do really simple names. I think the other thing to avoid generally is people make fun of it. It's kind of a meme now, but like uh my smith sticks, or whatever, like the just making up words that my moon phase, like words that um describe real world things but in a fantasy way can be really cringy to say out loud or read at times. And so I think the other piece too is just coming up with the simplest way to describe something that feels sort of on brand is usually a good approach. Rarely introduce new words or phrases, um, at least in Cloud Empress when you don't need to. So, I really like Stephen King's use of thinny, like a thin place in the Dark Tower series. That's a big inspiration. And I think people do call thinny is a kind of a known term, but he could have called it a number of things, but chose something that was colloquial and folksy. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's funny when people try to put those little colloquialisms in. When they work really well. I think Warhammer authors, especially Abnett, does a really good job of that. But I don't know if you saw the Rick and Morty episode where they go to like a post-apocalypse and they keep talking about like the before four times and like the new machine and stuff like that, and like rip on the whole concept of like of adding that kind of vernacular. And it's yeah, when you say it out loud, sometimes you're just like, did you think about that one? But yeah. So how do when using other works that you're inspired by, how would you become comfortable with being inspired by versus copying?
I am constantly nervous about this. Um, One of my biggest fears with Cloud Empress was I was just making Nausicaa with the numbers scratched off. And I think that is kind of a trend in TTRPGs right now. It's you have the licensed version or you have the unlicensed version. That's kind of the same thing. Like, oh, we haven't had a XYZ, there hasn't been a Terminator game yet. I'm going to make the Terminator game and it's going to be called Decimator. And we're just going to scratch all of the licensed words off. So we can't get copyright. And that stuff's cool. I mean, I want to play in a TTRPG that's based on Terminator, but I think the new Nosferatu, for example, that's a movie that's been made many times, and vampires are very frequently the source of media. So I think it's how do you bring your unique perspective? And I think this is also a reason why taking a more literary approach, if we want to use that term, is helpful, because you'll be reflecting on the time period by which you exist. And by that nature, it will feel different. Batman, right? Each different Batman is different because it's also reflecting on the time period that it exists in. And so I think those movies too more intentionally do that. I think Batman more intentionally tries to comment on the time period which it exists in, so they're a little bit more tolerable to watch. I came in very skeptical of the new Batman. I don't know if we needed it, probably not, but it was an enjoyable watch, I think, because it had a different tone and take and reflection on the society that it exists in. So I think that's the piece too. If you really lean into commenting on the universe and the human experience at the moment that you have a sentient view of it, even if it is derivative, it starts to feel unique. I think the other piece that I'm really inspired by is this web of creativity. And so Mobius is another inspiration of mine. And so you have all these connections between creatives that I think are really exciting. And I think in our current copyright environment and in an IP environment, oftentimes we're maybe afraid of using inspirations. But Mobius Mobius's drawings, I think it's Arzak, inspired Nausicaa's glider, right? So that's a really like very close. And then Mobius did the art for the Jodorowsky Dune, and so Dune is really inspired uh, Nausicaa, and so there's all these connections there. And then Dune inspires Alien, and there's and some of the art crew works. So there's this intermixing of creatives that I think if you don't know what your favorite work is derivative of, you just haven't like done enough research on it, because you'll start to realize like, oh, everything is highly derivative of everything else. It's oftentimes the creative I'm looking at, the references are like, you know, 20 years earlier than I'm aware of, in the 30s. Their references are in the 30s and I just don't know what they are, right? And as I do more research, I can start to figure out what those things are.
I would add on just if you feel that something is a little bit too close, it's not a bad idea to just acknowledge it and embrace it and make sure that if you're like, if this is super inspired by something, just say, even just put it in an appendix in the back. Just let people know
Yeah.
that you're not stealing, and that an inspiration, even if all you're doing is filing the numbers off. If you say this is just this with the numbers filed off, they'll go okay, versus being like, hey, that's plagiarism. So be careful. But I think
Yeah,
especially most people,
that's a great point.
yeah, I think most
Especially
people,
other
especially
TTRPG creators.
yeah. Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that most TTRPG creators will not care if you just acknowledge them. If you're talking about like big giant IPs, you might get a thing in the mail. But most creators, if you just acknowledge the inspiration, are happy to inspire you.
I think
How
too,
much
the
longer?
other piece is maybe 5-10 minutes. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm having fun. The other thing too is like there's marketing voice and then there's like content voice. And so if you go into marketing, you talk about your work maybe a little differently. So it's like, this is the Nausicaa inspired TTRPG, right? Like that's a good marketing hook, but I don't want people to necessarily feel that when they're playing it. I mean, it should echo, but it shouldn't feel to me like I don't see a lot of interest in recreating something that somebody's already made. And I think the other piece too is most media isn't good. So the fundamental question of TTRPG design in a um, like as it's popularized now is why are there 4 to 5 people walking around together consistently, I think. So that's a question you need to answer, right? So it's like not most media don't have like 4 or 5 people going everywhere together, right? So you need to like uh answer that question too, I think, with what you're creating. I don't know, that's something that you have so many good ideas and then you're like, why would these people be moving around together? Like there's no answer, so this isn't a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, if your characters are over 30, just the fact that they have 4 actual friends that hang out together is a bit of a stretch. So I guess it depends. Um, another question from Cerulean5 in chat. They said, what are some of your favorite adventures? And I know we had a list of literary adventures before, but what are some of your favorite adventures, and who are some of your favorite adventure writers working right now?
I tried to do the list to be encapsulate those things, but I Luke Gearing is like a favorite of mine. I did a writing mentorship with him, so take that with a grain of salt. But I think Luke Gearing's work is phenomenal and really creative and executed at a high level. I think maybe you're in the same boat, Ryan. I like reading systems a lot more than I like reading adventures. Um, I like because I think the other thing too, and this is just for me, which is kind of, but I'm a forever GM and I like writing adventures, and so I rarely run other people's adventures. I think I'm going to do a Triangle Agency adventure soon, so I'm looking forward to that. But I generally run my own stuff because I need to and I want to, and I hear that from other writers as well. So I would say the folks in the list would be a good place to start. I'm trying to think of other ones that are coming to my mind. I really like Snow's work. Um, the Wizards and Wastes second edition .dungeon, those are adventure adjacent, but they create a framework for adventure. So that's the other piece too. There are a lot of other ways to systematize generation of adventures. I think Electric Bastionland and Mythic Bastionland are like some of my new, well, Mythic Bastionland's not out yet, but one of my new favorite reads. And that's like a hex crawl generation. So that's another thing to look at, where it's the myths themselves. I'm probably getting too granular, but they kind of become adventures because they have these set plot points that you go through on a hex map. And so that would be another example. Electric Bastionland, Into the Odd, and I also like Frontier Scum a lot. I think the other piece too is like Frontier Scum's intro adventure. I don't consider particularly literary, but I consider the book literary because of the content. The adventure is going through a train where there's a bunch of like chicken people. The other thing is, I would say there are so many good Mothership modules. I'm part of a community of Mothership writers, so I get a lot of inspiration for some of the things they're doing mechanically in particular. Joel Hines is a big inspiration, and Desert Moon of Karth is like a huge inspiration on Cloud Empress. Ultraviolet Grasslands is a big inspiration. Very different approach to some of the ways that we're engaging with the worlds that we're presenting, but pretty exciting stuff. Morkborg has some good stuff as well. Yeah, I'm Anodyne Press and Ian with Hull Breach and the Blues one. I'm trying to think. Any adventure by Ian Euston is really good. So those would be the other pieces too. Some of those, I think Mothership and Morkborg tend to lean more into the genre though. So that's why I didn't include them in my list, is that most of the time they don't necessarily stretch out of the adventure or the experience they're trying to create in the moment. A lot of times that's the focus. And then there's not this like extra element of like pondering about why people do the things they do, or those internal aspects.
Yeah. So someone, I had something written down and someone in chat brought it up, so I wanted to bring it up too. Tyson writes in chat, said, you mentioned not wanting to include mechanics in the text. Side note, if people listen,
I wasn't sure if you're going to chop my head off or not. I don't know. It's
I think it's great. I love it because here's the thing, and one of the things that you said a bunch is that a lot of the way that you write adventures or the adventures you're writing aren't necessarily for beginner GMs, and I wish more people in the space acknowledged and worked with like what I have called, and what I think I stole that from Aaron and King, is called like 101 games and adventures versus like 201 or 301 stuff. Like not everything is for beginners, and not everything has to be for everyone. Like not all media is for everyone, and doesn't have to be for you, right? So when you have adventures that are more in depth, more complex, and for more experienced GMs that already know the system, I love when you're not like, roll the perception check. If it's a 15, do this. As like you said, it really breaks up the flow of the adventure, not just for the players, but for the GM. But they said, you mentioned not wanting to include mechanics in the text. What is your advice on adding new systems that build on the existing game?
I would say look at what is it? Oh gosh, what's the Luke Gearing after Pound of Flesh? It is called. Do you remember what it is? What's the
For
second
Mothership?
Luke Gearing? Yeah,
Gradient Descent?
yeah, Gradient Descent. I would say look at Gradient Descent as a really good example. So I think pulling those out, and I try to do some of that in like mini expansions and stuff. So I think you can layer it, but just put it somewhere in the front of the book, and then just assume that people are going to be using it. I think that probably is the way that reads the best to me. And then two, I think in Gradient Descent, Luke and Sean, they'll say this is a character who's not sure if they're human or not, right? So they'll reference the like theme that's coming up, but they don't necessarily. They might have some references to the mechanism frequently throughout. I don't remember, but I think just do a table somewhere, right? Just put the mechanism somewhere, and then just assume people are going to use it. Or you could even just throw like page X, page X, and just refer back to the page or link it in the PDF. I think that stuff reads a lot better. Um, I think reading manuals for me is so hard. My brain just dies sometimes when something's written a lot like a manual, and there's reasons for that. But again, I don't play most of the stuff I read. And so I'm really looking for an enjoyable reading experience where I'm not necessarily playing it in my head, but I'm going through it like a group might as a reader.
Yeah, again, if it's a starter adventure, I love boxes all over the place saying like this or that or whatever, especially if it's for a new system. But for something that's been out for a while and your GMs are very experienced, like you can, as you said, writing it in front of the book and allowing them to use it if they feel like later. Trust your players, trust your GM, trust the people that want your stuff to not be dummies. Like if people are playing the TTRPG and are that experienced in it, they probably know how to do it. You don't need to hold their hand the entire time. And I do like that. So a call out box would be the best place for that, separate from the text. I would say yes. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's or like margins, throwing stuff in the margins. Like you could do a separate margin or like a half page little pull out. Yeah, I think those are cool ideas.
All right. So, what themes really draw the particular audience that loves Cloud Empress to Cloud Empress relative to other settings? Like, what do you find that the real deep lovers of Cloud Empress love about it? I guess.
Bugs. We have a lot of bug lovers. We have a cicadas, just pictures of cicadas sub channel on the Discord. So it's really upfront about bugs. It's like, but cicadas are different. But roaches, like I mentioned, Reach of the Roach God, like
I was going
roaches.
to mention roaches.
Like roaches, I'm looking. I'm not seeing a ton of roaches in here. I haven't even opened. Yeah, I this is going out of print, so it's like I really wanted to have it. But roaches, the poop. I've lived, when you live in places with roaches, it's different maybe. Well, I mean, I'm sure, I'm sure they live in places with roaches too, but anyway, I would say ecological science fantasy are the three words that I put on the cover of the book. And I try to with art prompts, I try to make sure it sort of hits all three of those boxes. And so I would say ecological science fantasy is sort of what to hone in on. There's this sort of pastoral element. The world is relatively uninhabited, so there's a lot of sort of emphasis on nature and nature's cycles and humanity playing a smaller role within nature. I think Nausicaa in particular is a place to be mined. Dune, Star Wars, 70s media, science fiction media in general are all great places to start. And I think thoughts on violence and sort of complexifying violence. There's a lot of body horror too, sort of scattered about. So if you like body horror, that could be another place to explore theme-wise.
Um, touching a little bit on the same kind of topic here. Someone asked on Blue Sky, they asked, one of the best parts of Cloud Empress, but also the most intimidating, is how much the specific setting elements fit together. Do you have any guidance for adding new setting elements that still fit within the Cloud Empress world?
Yes. I'm glad people feel like it's a cohesive world. One of the most deliberate inspirations from Cloud Empress is Electric Bastion Land. And Electric Bastion Land does this really great thing where it's like there's Muppets, there's the underground, there's I forget what they call the Outlands. There's the Bastion Land itself. And so I think when designing Cloud Empress, I knew I wanted to work within this world for a long time. And so I tried to create a lot of spaces for exploration. And so I think, in my opinion, if you're hitting on the themes and the vibes, there's not a lot you can't explore. As I mentioned earlier, it's sort of in this nexus place. And so one of the characters in the new book has like a 50s leather greaser jacket on that's magical, or there's all sorts of things that sort of float through the world from other realities and even people from other realities. So there's like an Edgar Allan Poe character in the new one that's sort of like high on opium in the mud, like, and sort of pops up, and characters can deal with them. So there's ghosts. I think I tried to create, yeah, just a space where anything would be possible and you could fit it into the world pretty seamlessly. So I think just sticking with sort of the themes and the level of technology generally, I think you'll be okay. And I think those explorations on the borders are really interesting and ripe for exploration.
Yeah, I mean the way magic works and time and everything, things are coming in and out all the time, as you said, and it is like a future world. It's a future past world kind of thing. So, I would love to see someone just go nuts with that, and there's some type of like outbreak of this, and then all of a sudden, yeah, you have like 50s greasers and like all the rest of this stuff just like running all amok because of all this like warp stuff that happened. But there is a place if you stay true to the way the magic works and everything. There, you can kind of just dump anything in there, right?
And there's this thing called the slip, which is just like these reality storms that are inspired by Thinnies from the Dark Tower. And so there will be like 1 mile zones or even entire villages that are stuck in time or from different time periods, and or cycling or time looping or all sorts of stuff. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think it's like, does your idea draw on interesting tropes that get people excited to play? And can you tie that at all to sort of the overarching theme so that it feels like um, a fit? Maybe we'll do like one or two more.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple more because I'm crossing off ones that I feel like we hit already or that you hit already. Um,
My cat's
I feel
starting
like
to walk all over my table.
I feel like you hit on this one though. And if we did, we can just move on. It says one. This is from Blue Sky. It says my big one is always media recommendations. I love wrenching a core idea from the story and reworking it from tabletop. So beyond the points of inspiration in the book, what pieces of media do you think represent a solid framework for a literary adventure? But I feel like you didn't we have like whole slides on.
Yeah, I think though that I think I'm sort of interested in time periods now. So one of the things that I'm sort of exploring is like 2000s and late 90s video games as an inspiration. So there's sort of this optimism that I want back in my life, and maybe that's the rose-colored glasses, but um, like one of my new games is sort of inspired by like the colorful look of Advanced Wars, or some of the Game Boy Advanced era colors and positivity and excitement to be alive that I feel like is not present in 2025. I'm gonna be alive, and I'm gonna
Yeah.
fight, and I'm gonna be resilient, but
Not present in
at least
2025. The excitement to be alive.
not
There we
right
go.
now.
Yeah.
At least collectively.
Yeah.
So I think the other piece too is a lot of Cloud Empress draws on 70s and late, 70s to 85, maybe. I guess Nausicaa probably came out in like 91, but early anime, I guess, early anime and sort of 70s, 80s inspired stuff. So I think
84.
picking a time period, 84. Okay. Thank you. So picking a time period can be really interesting, and the vibes and the collective conscience of that time period. But I think too, looking for things that deeply emotionally scarred you or inspired you. I mean, I think it's just as well to do like, what would Cloud Empress's version of the Titanic be? If the Titanic was a big movie for you, channeling that into something, right? It doesn't need to be a ship that's crashing. It could be a tower that's slowly falling over. And you just start going with there. And what does it mean that the giant tower's falling over for society? Maybe this tower was a beacon of hope and now it's tipping over, right? So you can start to write it based on that and just skew a couple elements, and then maybe throw in, there's a faction that is like, there's a Terminator there. There's one Terminator that's clearing everyone out, whatever. So I think combining those elements, but looking maybe in summary for the things that deeply impacted you for certain reasons and honing in on what those reasons were, and also looking at maybe time periods where certain creative communities came together and sort of did similar work, or certain creative artists did a set of work that sort of stands together, and mining that for opportunities and interests too.
There's a couple more, but I think that we've touched a little bit on at least most of those, or we'll leave a couple for you for the Substack, and I think
Cool.
that we hit it all there. So, anything that you want to say to wrap this up? I know across the bottom for the entire time, for those that actually see this, is the information for the jam. And when this episode comes out, I'll make sure that the links to all of that information are below. But is there anything else that you wanted to say to kind of wrap up the writing literary adventures for Cloud Empress and beyond?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and it was exciting to talk about this stuff. And if you have comments or thoughts on the idea, or what you see in some of your favorite TTRPG adventures in particular, I'd love to hear that, in the comments of the YouTube when it's posted, or on Discord or other things, provided they're respectful and thoughtful, those kinds of things. But I think more dialogue about adventures and expansion content. I don't know, any kind of TTRPG dialogue is about the content itself is really exciting to me, and especially when people talk about the work that impacts them on an emotional level or intellectual level, I think too, rather than we had a really fun time at the table. That's awesome. But also, like, what are the things that kind of stir you? What are the things that are, changing your worldview or impacting you? I'd love to hear like what those are, and so I can read them. So thanks.
And thank you for coming on. I know Liminal Horror has done this a couple of times. They've done at least 2, so you're more than welcome to come back and meet or beat that anytime you have stuff coming out. Obviously, you're getting close to, I think, one of the most like number of appearances on the show of anyone, if not already at the top. So, but
is it Penguin now? I think I'm not in trouble anymore.
Jared's
got me beat now, so I think I have to worry about that crown.
A monthly scheduled episode that is literally like themed around them.
So
they don't count anymore.
They don't count anymore.
Yeah. But yeah, I just want to say thank you, Watt. Obviously, you're always welcome here because of not only are you an amazing creative and we love all the things you do, but you're a genuinely awesome person who really elevates all of the people and things around them, and we really appreciate you and you appreciating us and being open to coming on and sharing these things, using us as the way to do that. So we're always going to appreciate that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Cool. So that is the end of writing literary adventures for Cloud Empress and beyond. As I said, you can find all of our links below. I'll make sure all of the links for Watt are available there as well, where the normal internet puts their things, so you can find all of these. And that's gonna be it. So once again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone in chat for being here. You all have a wonderful day. Bye.